In this video, we'll be discussing generation of components. So how do we generate components in Angular? Well, let's see an example by adding the navigation component. So to add the navigation component, I'm going to press Ctrl-tilde to open this command line or terminal here, right in VS Code. And I'll type clear to clear the terminal. And to add the navigation component, I'll just generate it. So ng generate component navigation. All right, so let's make that a bit wider so you can see it better. And let's just press the enter key to run this command. That's it. So now our app folder has been updated with another component in another subfolder, and that component is navigation. So we've got navigation component CSS, HTML, spec.ts, and component.ts. So in other words, we've got the CSS file, the template file, the test file, and the class file. Note that our navigation component structure is exactly the same as what we had in the app component. The only difference is that the app component had two additional files, the app.module.ts and app.routing.module.ts. This makes perfect sense because Angular modules are used to combine several components together, which is what we will do next. If we were to describe our new navigation component files in a diagram, it would look almost the same as the diagram for the app component, minus the two module files. Let's inspect the class component for the navigation component. So I'll press Command tilde again to close the terminal. Now we're in the class file, so let's discuss it a bit. Looking at the contents of the class file of our navigation component, we can see that at the very top, there's an import of component and onInit functionalities from Angular core. Both the component and the onInit are examples of an interface. In TypeScript and some other languages, an interface is used when we want to make sure that a class sticks to a contract of sorts. What this means is that a class will implement an interface. So if we define an interface to have the property of name set to string, that means that a class which will implement that interface will have to have a property name set to a string. So when we say that an interface is sort of like a contract, what we mean is that if something is defined in the interface, then that same thing should be used in a class implementing the interface. On lines 3 to 7 of our code, the @component decorator defines the selector, the template URL, and the style URLs, just like we saw in the app components class. Next, we export the navigation component class. It implements the onInit interface. The onInit interface is a part of the component lifecycle mechanism. A component during its lifecycle gets initialized, added to the virtual DOM, etc. The ngOnInit allows us to tap into this lifecycle and do something at a certain point of a component's life. In our case, when the component gets initialized. Of course, the ngOnInit is just one method inside the lifecycle sequence. There are others too. Back to our navigation component, on line 10 of its class file, we can see the call to a constructor. We inject dependencies of our class inside this constructor method. On the other hand, the ngOnInit is ran after the component's DOM is built and injected, and all the dependencies that came into the constructor are already processed. The constructor simply constructs our component. Once a component is, so to say, alive, we can use various lifecycle hooks. Since we want to add some logic as soon as the component is mounted into the DOM, we tap into the ngOnInit moment of our component's lifecycle. Of course, this was all generated for us, so at this moment we are not adding any updates to the ngOnInit lifecycle hook. So there it is. We've just covered the code inside the class file for our newly generated navigation component. Next, we'll look at the template file and CSS file of our navigation component. The template file for our navigation component is really simple, with the text navigation works inside of it. The CSS file for the navigation component is currently empty. Thus far, this is all the code for our navigation component. Let's now improve it by first adding the actual navigation code to the template file of our navigation component. We'll start with the nav tag. We'll also add the closing nav, and then we'll add li, and inside of the li we'll add an a with an href, the pound, then we'll type 1, and we'll copy this so as to add a few more. All right, so let's just clean it up a little bit. And there you have it. Our navigation component is prepared. Next, we need to actually display this code on our web page. So let's think this through. When we open our localhost 4200, a web page displays the text "Welcome to my app." We know that these words come from app component HTML file. So how do we tell the app component to show the navigation component? To add the navigation component to the app component, we will need to update the app component HTML file like this. Above the div right here, we'll just add app-navigation and also close it. And now save it. So let's make sure that everything is saved, and now we'll refresh our browser. Well, our browser is not running at the moment, so let's go ngs, and now it's going to serve our app with all the updates we've added. Of course, Angular still needs to bundle all the changes, so now let's hit the refresh button again, and there you have it. We have our nice navigation now. Of course, perhaps we would need to change the links as well to 2 and 3, just to make them a bit different from one another, and then our change is updated right here. All right, great. Now we can have a look at another diagram for our Angular app and see how these two components fit together. So let me stretch this a little bit and open it right here, and there you have it. So we've got the navigation component with a class, the template, and the CSS, and it goes into the app modules template right here. So looking at this image right here, we can conclude that the navigation component is now simply a child of the app component. However, there is more to it than just adding the app navigation custom tag to the app component template file, and it has to do with Angular automatically updating files when a component gets created. So basically what that means is that when we generate a component, Angular automatically updates app.module.ts. So let's open app.module.ts and confirm that this is what's happened. So, as discussed earlier, there were 4 imports at the top of the app module file, well, at least initially, and now there are 5. So this is the addition here. So the 5th import statement simply imports the navigation component from the navigation component file. Of course, as it was mentioned earlier when we were looking at how ngModule works, we need to declare all the components that the app module will use. So initially, when we generated our app, the declarations key only had a single file, the app component, and now it's also adding the navigation component. That's all that it takes for a new component to be added to a module in Angular. Even better, Angular does this automatically whenever a new component is generated. Now that we know how this works, we will have no problems to add other components and understand what behavior to expect and how everything fits together. Alright, so now we can style the navigation component. So obviously our navigation is currently unstyled, so we cannot update the navigation component CSS file with some simple styling to make it look more like an actual navigation. So let's make it simple and just update the CSS for the navigation component as follows. So let's save it, and it's starting to shape up. When I save this, it starts to look even better. And finally, I'll style the links themselves. So I'll go nav lia, and here I'll just type color white and text decoration set to none. All right, so let's save that as well and see the update right here. Now, while we're at it, we might as well update the CSS of the app component. So basically what I want to do is give some spacing between the app component and the navigation component. So for now, let me just type P20 and I'll set it to padding 20 pixels. And now inside app component HTML, class is P20. All right, and I'll remove this style right now. So I'll Control X, save everything, and let's see what happens. All right, so when I inspect this thing right here, let me just put this down. So when I inspect the H1, I see that the H1 goes under the navigation bar. So obviously it's not behaving properly. So there are several ways to fix this, but I'll actually use the host selector in my app component file, app component CSS file. So I'm going back to the app component CSS and I'll add this host to the very top here, and I'll say display flex. File, save all. And now when I hover over it again, it's no longer getting pulled in under the navigation. So that's it for now. I'll commit another git commit for this lesson, and I'll see you in the next one.